Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. It's time for the C3 stream. Okay, you guys are picking up my sound now, but that's through my webcam. That's not through my microphone. We're all attached. You guys can hear me now, but it doesn't sound good, right? Yeah, okay, so you can hear me at least. But it doesn't sound super good. Why? Huh. Why is my microphone not playing nice today? I can hear through it, which is odd. Peculiar. But it is not making noise, huh? What up with that? What up with that? Oh man. Status unplugged. How in the world? Now it's unplugged because I unplugged the thing. It's been a long time since we've had tech issues, hasn't it? It's been a while since we've done it. Alright, so I think it's rebooting. Still says status unplugged though. Well, that's not cool. So you guys can all hear me fine. Joe says fine. Alright, so it's not ideal, huh? But you guys can at least hear me. Because for whatever reason, my microphone's going fritzy on me. Well, one of those days, guys. It's just one of those days. One of those days. Okay. So you guys are picking up my audio. It just doesn't sound as good as it normally would. Not sure why I'm not getting my audio through my microphone. Because it says it's unplugged, which is really weird. And I can hear it through my headphones, but I cannot get audio to go through it, which is also very peculiar. Alright. Well, golly. Sorry, guys. Is this sound good enough that you guys can track along? Are you guys good enough that I can go ahead with teaching, or like, do I need to hit the pause button on tonight and do some troubleshooting? What do you guys think? Yes? Bruce says yes. Hey Bruce, thanks for being here. Hey Joe. Hey Pam. Alright, you guys are saying yes. Go ahead. It's good enough. good enough, but it's not the good mic. All right. You have to be using the webcam mic. I have to do it. Cool. Well, sorry for that, guys. We haven't had a tech issue in ages. I don't even know why in the world that would have some problems to it, but go figure. Thanks for tuning in tonight, guys. Thanks for joining me. We're supposed to be doing Bible study instead of doing putzing on all this stuff. We're supposed to be doing that. It says test your microphone. I got the right microphone. I don't know, guys. I am not sure. I will have to troubleshoot it another day. You're good, brother. Move on. All right, we're moving on. Sounds good to me. Okie dokie dokie. Luke 7, that's where we are. That's what we should be talking about, is Luke chapter 7. That's what we're studying right now. We are in the Gospel of Luke, and in being part of the Gospel of Luke is, dun 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 dun, doing that, and doing that. Sweet. So we're doing the Gospel of Luke. We're in chapter 7, thereabouts. Picking up where we left off last week. Yeah, so we'll do a little bit of review, and then we'll just keep trucking along. So if you're tuning in for the first time or a long time, you guys know that we're doing a narrative look at the Bible. That means that we are taking our time, kind of going at a nice pace, frankly, just kind of really slow. Just kind of taking our time, going story by story, verse by verse, and reading through the Gospel of Luke right now. The reason we're reading through the Gospel of Luke, as a reminder, is because Luke is the first part to a two-part. It's part 1. Part 2 is the book Acts. That Acts of the Apostles, the book of Acts, is actually got the same author as the book of Luke. Luke and Acts are specifically written to go together. They're very intentionally supposed to go together. They're written by the same guy. He's a physician, Luke. He writes them to a wealthy patron who is financing Luke's exploration and gathering of materials. Perfectly common in the old world, kind of like ancient world. That's how things were done. You wrote a book by having somebody foot the bill up front, and then you do your research, and then you'd write it. Bookmaking was very expensive in the ancient world. It's not like what we have today. I mean, they did not have computers that you just type, or even just you didn't talk into a microphone and words came up type thing, right? So the whole process by which a book was created, circulated, copied, very expensive to do. And so Luke takes initiative with a patron backing him to write these accounts. The first account is focused entirely on the life, death, resurrection of Jesus. This is where we get the Gospel of Luke. And then the second account is got to do with the church, the birth of the church, the launching of the church, really grounded in the life of Paul. We'll get to that when we get to the book of Acts. But it has a lot to do with the book, the life of Paul, his conversion and starting of all the various churches. It kind of makes a switch around, around chapter 6 or 7 or so in the book of Acts. So the reason that we're doing Luke and then Acts is because if you go way back, we started with Genesis. We started with Genesis, and we have been tracking our way with a chronological look through the Bible. A reminder for you as well, the book is not written, the good book. The Bible is not actually put together in chronological order. It is put together in the thematic and by genre. It is ordered according to a sense of, like the library. I mean, that's exactly what it is. You get your nonfiction, you get your fiction, you get your mysteries, you get your romance. Same thing with the Bible. The Bible's got its various components and parts that comprise it, that put it all together. And so the Old Testament is broken into a bunch of chunks, as is the New Testament. So the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it's not like they were written first even. Some of the epistles of Paul were written potentially earlier than the Gospels. But we're specifically choosing Luke, and we're specifically choosing Acts because of the way that Luke and Acts tie together with where we were previously, right? So we're not going to spend our time on Mark or Matthew or John in the immediate future. We're not going to be doing that. We're going to stay with the Luke and Acts, and then we'll dive into the epistles a little bit after that and dance through some of the epistles so you have an idea. All right, that's a long-winded introduction for you. Luke chapter 7, we finished off with verse 10. We talked a lot last week about the faith of the Roman officer. That's the heading that we've got, I'm using the New Living Translation just as a reminder for you. Whatever translation you're using is great. But this story has to do with this Roman officer who's got a slave, and Jesus acts as a healer in relation to his slave. And we talked about how this story is one of the most critical stories for understanding Luke's perception of the gospel. His understanding of the good news is grounded in this story because it means it's for the whole world. It's not just for the Jews. Jesus is the Jewish Messiah, but he did not come just for the Jews. Here is a great example where we see him branching far beyond the Jewish population and welcoming, accepting that faith can be found, in fact, within the heart and the context of a Gentile, a non-Jew, in this case the Roman officer. And we noted how this forecasts in the book of Acts when we get to Cornelius and we get to a story that has to do with Peter. Simon Peter being a big guy in the New Testament as well. One of the big disciples, apostles of Jesus, has an interaction with a Roman officer that similarly expands, according to Luke, the size and the scope of Jesus, his ministry, and salvation itself. So this is a really big story. Really, really, really big story that we did last week. And it left us off, and we just started to dabble in this one. We just started to kind of dabble in this one. Jesus raising a widow's son. So I'd like to revisit this, spend a little bit more time in it, because we actually didn't get to go in very deep. So here we go. Jesus raises a widow's son. Soon afterward, Jesus went with his disciples to the village of Nain. Let me do a quick look up on that. What did we say? It's like a small village up north, right? Yeah, it's just a small village up north. They think they might have excavated it, but no one really knows. Let's be honest. Nobody really knows. Gets referred to. Nothing exciting there. And a large crowd followed Jesus. So Jesus has quite the following right now. We mentioned how 2 chapters ago, I believe it was, we've got Jesus doing the Sermon on the Mount, or rather in Luke, the Sermon on the Plain, right? It's the same thing, but in Matthew, it's referred to as the Sermon on the Mount. In Luke, it's referred to as the Sermon on the Plain. So he's got a lot of people with him, and these people are very excited about who Jesus is. He has left behind largely the Pharisees, who don't like him. There's a whole bunch of conflict that happens at the beginning part of Luke. And now it's just really Jesus and his buddies. So soon after we have this incredible experience where Jesus has a faith outside of Israel, we get a follow-up story. And it's interesting because by using the word soon after, it would seem to suggest that there's a tie to the previous story, which there is. We'll get to that. But by introducing this new story and this next segment, by saying soon afterward, it's intentionally pulling us backwards into where we just came off of. So soon after this incredible worldwide ripple effect healing story, Jesus went with his disciples to the village of Nain, a small, inconspicuous village up north in kind of the Galilee area, roughly, and a large crowd of people has followed him. Now things get interesting. A funeral procession was coming out as he approached the village gate. I shared with you guys last week that funeral processions were a natural part of the ancient world. They were a big to-do. The village of Nain would have been small enough. You're probably talking 30, 40, 50 people in a village this size. That would have been like common for, comparable to like Nazareth, if you will. You're talking about 30 to 50 people. And so if you only have 30 to 50 people in the town, like everybody's here, okay? And everybody would have been aware of the death and would have probably participated in the procession. It's kind of like when you're that small, everybody shows up. So the whole town is participating in this funeral procession. In the Roman world, of which this is a part of, funeral processions were a very big deal culturally. Just culturally, they were expected. And it's really a procession. It's a long line of people where you have a body at usually in the middle. Um, in the front, you have wailers, mourners. It was actually a profession. Believe it or not, you could be a professional mourner. You could like make a living uh, wailing and mourning. You would walk in front of the funeral procession and cry and throw dirt in the air and try to capture and introduce what was coming behind you. You could be a professional mourner in that day and age, and so you probably had a handful of people in the front who are crying very loudly. Often there would be a separation of gender, male and sex and gender. That there would be, the women basically would kind of clump together as the wailers, and they would usually be up front, preceding the body, getting a lot of attention because of the significance of the voice. I mean, literally at the top of their lungs, they're like yelling and whooping and screaming, right? So this is a big to-do. And for Jesus to come like rolling up here with his own crowd, his own group of followers, I mean, you got to picture like, I don't know, in my head, it's almost like the Wild West where you have like, you know what I'm talking about? It's like Clint Eastwood style, where you got Jesus walking up to the gate, and you got this funeral procession with someone leading the way, walking up to the gate, and it's almost like who's gonna give? Like, what is what is going to happen? There's this sense of anticipation that's being built by this line. Luke has an incredible ability to bring up a huge number of details. Luke is so detail oriented. You cross-reference that with the example of Mark. Mark is as succinct as you can be. He is all about like, get in there and get done. Jesus came, he died for your sins, he loves you, boom, game over. 13 chapters. Luke, holy cats. 28 chapters, literally over twice as long, packed with these rich, rich details. And so you get this sense of Jesus standing at, he's approaching the village gate just at the same time that this funeral procession is approaching the village gate. So you get this really rich, textured imagery that's going on here. Excuse me. We come to find out as well that it's a young man, all right? Thanks, Michelle. You're great. Never boring. We try. Yeah, you weren't picturing Clint Eastwood when you were reading this before, but now you will. What's going to happen next? But I mean, that's the sense. That's the idea. You get this crowd with Jesus who are following Jesus, and I don't know, are they talking? They're chatting. Clearly, they're following him. And you got to wonder if you're part of the disciples and you're part of this crowd that's following Jesus, a large crowd, no less, right? One of the things that it distinguishes here is large crowd over and against the assumption that it's just the disciples. So sometimes when people read like Jesus and the disciples or Jesus and a crowd, they picture like 20 people. This is really trying to give a sense of like, I don't know, girth, size, a large crowd, and disciples. Right? It doesn't just say one of the. Jesus went with his disciples, so you're already up to, you're up to his 12 disciples plus Jesus. And one of the things that we often forget is that the disciples were in many cases married. It's not often talked about in the Bible. We don't know many details about it, but there are numerous allusions to it. As a simple example for you, we saw earlier in the Gospel of Luke where Jesus heals Peter's mother-in-law. Thank you, mother-in-law. He's married. Later on, the Apostle Paul will talk about how the apostles have families, and in some cases can actually. The Apostle Paul makes the case that the apostles have the right to depend upon the church for payment, salary, because that they have families to take care of. He actually makes the case that it's appropriate for the church to take care of the preachers and teachers because they have families that depend upon them, and they're there to take care of the flock, right? So the reason I bring it up is to say, you got Jesus, his disciples, and potentially some spouses that are tagging along, We don't really know anything about kids related to the disciples. We really don't know. The Bible doesn't give us anything there. But it wouldn't. I mean, 12 guys. Some of them are married. Like, it wouldn't be surprising to have kids part of this traveling. And he's up north, which is where many of his disciples are from. Okay, many of the disciples are from this area, this region of Galilee. So he's in proximity to the disciples' homes, and thus it's just kind of logical, makes sense that there's people. This is a long-winded way of saying there's people and not just a few people. So when you bring Jesus with all his disciples, their families, the whatever, and the large crowd of additional disciples, like disciples lowercase d, not the apostles, but disciples as in learners and students following him, you got a lot of people. Big old crowd following Jesus. Big old crowd following this funeral. And the question becomes, what's going to happen when these two crowds meet? What's going to take place? This is drama. I mean, either Jesus is going to have to say, like, hey, everybody, stay on the right side of the street so the funeral can pass us by. I mean, talk about awkward, right? I mean, there's a sense of what is Jesus specifically going to do in relation to this as well. Now, bear in mind the backdrop. So far, we've seen a whole lot of healing. We've seen demons get cast out. I mean, this is going all the way back to Luke chapter 4, where Jesus said he's here to preach, good news to the oppressed, the captive, the blind. He's here to heal and save and redeem, right? So Jesus has been largely associated with healings, the casting out of demons here, but we haven't had any major experiences with death specifically, right? And this story actually sets up and is directly tied to the following story when we get to this question. So, but we're not there yet. Don't get ahead, Andrew. Don't get ahead. Okay. All right. Back it up. So you got this Clint Eastwood. Both sides are facing off at each other at the village gate. That's important. We'll come back to that. At the village gate. So it's at the opening to the village where, the countryside is hilly. Galilee is very hilly. Israel is very hilly with lots of plateaus. There are a couple plateaus and then valleys. I mean, there's some flat valleys where you would farm. Galilee itself, though, is a pretty hilly area, and so it would be reasonable to assume that the village gate, is at the entrance to a valley, or perhaps it's on top of a mountain, one of the two. The young man, all right, now we find out who died. The young man who had died, okay, pause there. Yeah, so it's a young guy. It's not like an elderly statesman that is ready to go. It's a young man. The significance of the loss makes sense then also that the funeral procession would be so significant because of the nature of the loss being a young man. I can remember back when I was in Washington State. When I was a pastor in Washington for a year, our church held a funeral for a young woman. She was in high school, and she passed away. Hugely tragic. And it was one of those times where the church could fit comfortably 300 people, 400 people in it. Oh my gosh. It was like standing room only. Back out into the foyer. For those of you who know that old-fashioned word, foyer. It's kind of like a mini atrium. An atrium that wishes it was bigger. Can I call a foyer that? An atrium that wishes it was an atrium. We had chairs in the foyer going all the way back, wall to wall. It was packed. Simply by virtue of the loss, right? It was a young woman. It was significant. So you got to figure in the same way that the loss of a young man has significant ripple effects into the relationships of the various people. Moms, dads, cousins, schoolmates, etc., etc. the significance of losing a young person can never be underscored enough. I mean, it just is what it is. Further, you find out, it's a young man. It seems to suggest by the language there. Let me look something up real quick. I don't want to make a. No. What I want to establish is the. Look it up in BDAG. BDAG is a funny. Let's go to the lemma, the Greek. I want to know how young he was. That's what I'm trying to find out. Like, is this a boy? I don't remember. It's not a boy, I don't believe. Is this one word? Let's. Oh, it is. That whole thing. All right. So here you go. You guys want to know how complicated Greek is? Greek? I mean, in some way, you know what, to be honest, it's probably English that's complicated. Let's be honest. It's English that's the complicated language. I can't imagine learning English. So, the young man who had died is all one word. Sure. Technon. Okay. So, oh no, teth, not tech, teth. Tethnekos. Okay. So this is all, can you believe that? What takes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all these words in English is one word in Greek. Crazy. No, I want to stay on the technos. All right, what's suggested here, though, is that it's a young man. What I want to differentiate is that it's not like a boy, per se. This is a young man who is broaching adulthood. The reason why this is particularly important is the next line. Let's get rid of the interlineary. We find out that the young man who had died was a widow's only son. Don't know about daughters, don't know about that, but only son. What would be suggested by this line is that, all right, she's a widow. So we know that she's a widow, and usually in the olden days, if you were a widow, you were dependent on other people for financial stability and income. The only exception would be is if you had a young man. If you had a boy, if you had a young guy, if you had a 14-year-old at home who could work, he would go and work, and he would go and provide for the family, right? He'd go out and he'd learn a trade, and he'd send his money to take care of the family. So he would become the man of the house, right? Don't we even have that saying, we're the man of the house type thing? In this case, the widow has lost her husband, which introduces the idea of, okay, she has already in her own person experienced significant loss. Tragic, significant, life-altering loss. So much so that it's not just the loss of a relationship, but it's a loss of identity, a question of provision. It's a question of being able to maintain the integrity of the family left behind, right? This is one of the reasons why, if you go into Paul's writings, Paul is so avidly, he's so big on taking care of the widows and the orphans. Look at the book of James, which is James, not even Paul, but James. James, what is faith but to, take care, what is love and faith but to take care of the widows and the orphans, right? Widows and orphans have a special place within the context of the church family because they're considered to be vulnerable population. They're considered to be an oppressed, vulnerable, marginalized. They're dependent on other people. Now, life expectancy was not terribly long in the ancient world, and so widows were actually far more common in one sense. Women have always had a longer life expectancy than men. It's true to today. I forget what the difference is, but women, way to go, ladies. You take care of yourselves, you watch over yourselves, and you seem to have a longer life expectancy than men. Generally speaking, broad brushstrokes. Okay, you guys get it. So the reality is that in that context, widows and orphans were common, low life expectancy, and specifically, men, physical labor, war, drafts. Not uncommon to get drafted into a war. So widows and orphans are normal. It also suggests in this story then that this widow depended on her only son, this young man, for finances and provision. So this is just a big line because there's just a lot in there. Oh, and what's this? A large crowd from the village was with her. See? Large crowd. Large crowd. It's a standoff. And who is at the center of it? Jesus. This is a big deal because Jesus stands at the center point, coming face to face with death. Jesus is facing off with death in front of the world. See, that's why you guys tune in. Didn't think of it that way, did ya? Jesus is facing off with the power of loss, marginalization, oppression, pain, suffering. He is facing and going toe-to-toe with what it means to have loss in your life, and he's doing it on a world stage in front of a crowd. Like a mega crowd. 2 large crowds. One of which, interestingly enough, is anticipatory because they're following him, right? One of which is following, their motives have to do with Jesus. The other half of the world is here because of the sense of loss, which, is actually a good reflection theologically of how the church operates. That, Jesus stands at the centerpiece, where on one hand you have the church, followers of Jesus, here to see what Jesus will do in their lives and the lives of other people. But then you have the world, the rest of the world, which is just dealing with loss, pain, dealing with the reality of suffering, and trying to make meaning and trying to find a way forward through it. And Jesus comes to face with that, right? And part of the question here, and what they're starting to point us to is, well, will this large crowd be absorbed into this large crowd? Ooh, the drama builds. All right. When the Lord saw her, his heart overflowed with compassion. Thank you, Jesus. Thank you, Jesus. This is a character statement. This is a character statement about what it means for Jesus to see her. Note that. Jesus saw her. He didn't look past her. He wasn't unobservant. Jesus wasn't captured by the fanfare of the procession. He saw a grieving woman, a grieving mom. He saw someone overcome and desperate, filled to the brim with pain. He noticed her. He picked her out of the crowd. And his heart overflowed with compassion. So when Jesus looks upon the hurting person, this is what his character leads him to do. To hurt with her. That's what compassion means. Do you guys know that? Did you guys ever do a study of the... Let's study it together. See what the Greek says. Compassion is a fascinating word because most people don't know what it actually means. All right. Ooh, look at that. That's a fancy one. Yeah, I'm not going to be able to say that 10 times fast, guys. Splangsnizomai. Have pity, have compassion, feel compassion. Ooh, partake in a pagan sacrifice. That's interesting. I'd have to read more about that. I have no idea what that means or why that's there. Somewhere in the Bible or in extra biblical places it must be used. gag, and then also no, I don't like that. Most people sadly don't get at the root of what compassion means, the root of the word compassion. So come is C-O-M, and then passion. So passion, ironically, most often than not, is associated with like zeal, like passion, fervor. But at its root, it's got to do with to feel pain, to the point of pain, right? That's why we refer to Holy Week often as the passion experience. That the cross is actually referred to as the passion. It's because of the level of pain. So compassion is to experience pain along with. So when you see somebody who's hurting and you have compassion, it means you hurt with their hurt. You feel hurt in a way that is reflective of the other person's hurt. The reason why, that's interesting is because here in this context, we see Jesus hurting in the same way that the widow hurts. That when the widow deals with death and the level of death that it's wrought in her life, Jesus' response is to hurt with her. Sometimes we have this idea that God can't hurt, that God can't sometimes it's one of the things that we associate with Jesus mostly because he's human. We're able to get the sense that Jesus can hurt physically because we get the idea of the cross and crucifixion, but we don't get the significance always. We sometimes are too quick to look past the significance of Jesus hurting emotionally. And in this case, to make the statement, his heart overflowed with compassion, is to say, Jesus looked upon this hurting woman and felt an overwhelming amount of hurt alongside of her over her loss and the significance of her loss. Jesus hurt. God hurt. This is why elsewhere in the Bible we see like Jesus weeping. Jesus wept, shortest verse in the Bible, Gospel of John, and that's got to do with death as well. It's got to do with Lazarus. Jesus weeps with Lazarus. Okay. Don't cry, Jesus says. I'll be honest, that's a little insensitive in my book. I was trained differently, but he's Jesus, so I'm not going to argue with him. My chaplaincy training wasn't to show up to somebody when they had died and say, don't cry. But then again, I don't hold the power of life and death in my hands. So I suppose Jesus can say that in a way that I just simply can't. All right, don't cry, he said. Then he walks over to the coffin and he touches it, which is kind of taboo, right? You're not supposed to touch a coffin. This is me talking. I don't have anything to base that on, some great theological statement, but that's just like, Jesus, you're touching it? I mean, he's stopping, obviously, the bearers stopped. Well, yeah, when you walk up to a coffin and you touch it, what's the Greek word for touch? I wonder if he grabs it. To make close contact with. Touch. Take hold of. Cling to. Oh, sometimes in association with all right. So my resource here tries to make the case specifically that this word choice is used. There would have been other word choices that the author could have used to say like touch, like reach out his hands. It could have said like reach out his hand or something like that. But to imply touch here, it tries to make the case that it was more than simply halting the bearers, right? He could have used a different word there, and instead is associated with his intended purpose to raise the dead man. Also associated with the touching of healers. Oh, that's interesting. or interacting with a healer. Oh, that's why. Okay. So the idea, this is the same word that's used when like Jesus heals, right? It's more than just like a physical touch your hand. It's like touching with intent. Touching in such a way that there's life and healing on the other side. That's fascinating. Touch his cloak, touch the tassel or the hem of his cloak. That happens in Matthew and Mark. Okay. So it's used elsewhere in the Bible too. So he reaches out and he touches it, grabs a hold, clings it, with an intent of healing, which is exactly where he goes with this. The bearers stop, thank goodness. But talking about awkward. Could you imagine being one of these bearers? Talk about awkward. Like you're doing your duty, right? And all of a sudden, this. I mean, there's nothing to suggest that the village knows who Jesus is. I mean, maybe they do, but his fame is spreading by this point. He's pretty popular by this point. Maybe some in the crowd know. Maybe some of the people have seen him teach before. He's up in Galilee, which is where his stomping grounds would have been. So it's possible. It's possible that some of these people would have been watching. Some of the people from the village would have known who he was. But at the same time, if you're one of these bearers and just this random dude with a big crowd behind him comes up and touches the coffin, yeah, I'd stop too. Be like, dude, what are you doing? That's awkward. All right, now we get to this idea of pronounced word, which we've seen being built up over the last couple chapters, to be frank. Most significantly right before it, we see that with a simple word, Jesus has the ability to heal. And we've seen previous to this, Jesus with a word can cast out demons. So he gives a command here. He gives a directive. This is not like a, hey, little guy, you want to wake up now? This is Jesus saying, young man, I tell you, get up. I mean, in many ways, he's taking choice out of this. Not to get lost in a rabbit hole of free will versus predestination, etc., but to acknowledge that Jesus is giving a command to a dead man right now. He is, with his words, commanding. This is not an option. This is not like a question or would you like to sort of situation. This is the God of the universe incarnate commanding a dead man to get up. And he does. The dead boy sat up. Yeah, well, if the God of the universe shows up and gives you a face-to-face and says, do this, you're going to do it. Whether y'all want to or not. He's God. So what he says goes, right? I mean, he spoke creation into being. The dead boy sits up, and he begins to talk. Isn't that great? I mean, I really want to know what he said. We don't. I really am curious. What do you guys think he said? This feels like, do you guys know the Easter joke with Pastor Bob? You guys all know, some of you guys know the Easter joke with Pastor Bob, right? Above the ta-da, right? You guys, you might know that one if you know that one. What do you think this boy says when he sits up? Oh no, so here's interesting. He must be young enough because here we get the ta-da! See? Y'all are tracking. You know. Katie knows. Katie, thank you. You know. That's hilarious. I'm so glad, Katie, that you got that. The dead boy, and here we get young man. So, okay, he's young enough. He's definitely young enough because otherwise, let's see if they change the word. Power lookup, and the answer is dead body, dead man, stems from a dead. Nah, it doesn't really give you good. Oh, it's in. Okay. So there. That's a translator move here. Because of the word up here, this just means a dead body. So it really says like transliteral. Then the dead one. Then the dead. It just means then the dead. And so the editor is suggesting boy here based on the aforementioned. So the dead boy sits up and says, "Ta-da!" That's hilarious. Like, what would you say if you sit up and be like, "Hey, what's up, man? I'm thirsty. I don't know. What do you say after coming back? And who are you?" And his mom's right there, and there's all these people there. Yeah, perhaps he was in disbelief. Did the boy know he was even dead? I don't know. Michelle, I don't know. That's a good question. Did he just like fumble over his words? What do you think this kid said? You told me to stay away from the light. I ran the other direction. You know? Sarah Tibbetts, the Tibbetts family, tuning in all the way on vacay from Florida. Hopefully you're sipping something with an umbrella in it right now as you're watching. As a mother, I love that Jesus gave him back to his mother. Right? I cannot imagine how her heart felt at that moment. She probably couldn't stop hugging him. Isn't that wonderful? The first thing that Jesus does, I mean, regardless of the boy, right? Regardless of whatever this kid said, which I still think must have been hilarious. I don't know, funny, maybe it's just me and my sense of humor, but like, talk about a chance for a great punchline. But the first thing that Jesus does, again, asserting a level of command and control. This is not passive Jesus. This is active Jesus. Sometimes people have this sense that Jesus was very passive, laissez-faire, apathetic, just kind of peace-loving Jesus who walked around preaching, moral teacher. No. Jesus is far more assertive. He's not afraid to argue. He's not afraid to get in people's faces. And he's not afraid to take this young boy by the arm and give him back to his mom. I mean, in many ways, this is kind of like this is almost like a forecast moment. Sorry, death's been on my mind a lot today. I was with someone while they died today. I had the privilege of praying with a family over one of our church people, a saint, a brother in faith of ours, who has now gone before us today. That's why I'm dressed the way I am. I wore the collar today to help ground me and remind me of that. And I was in the hospital. I was in a hospice today with the family, and literally spent time with the family, and then decided it was time to bless and pray over our brother and commend him into God's hands. We read the Bible together. We read some of his favorite Bible verses that I had visited with him last week as well when his health was declining and he was still cognizant. We were able to converse. We took communion together. And he shared with me some of his favorite Bible verses. So today, at his bedside, I read those Bible verses over him, laid a hand on him, and started to pray. And by the time I had finished praying, he had died. And he now sleeps the sleep. And he is waiting, like we all will someday, he is now waiting for Jesus to show up and say, I tell you, get up. And part of the beauty that we find within the Christian calling and faith is the practice and understanding, the hope and the anticipation of being reunited with others that we love. And so here we have an example of Jesus who says, young man, I tell you, get up. Raises him literally from, brings him back from death. And the first thing that Jesus does is reunite this young man with those that love him, which is an incredible testimony. And in many ways a forecast of the promise that we all have, right? in the same way that this brother in faith of ours that has gone before us, we will be reunited with him someday. That's part of our testimony. That's part of what we believe as Christian people, that we believe in the resurrection of the dead. And when we are raised from the dead, this almost echoes into that future, kind of bouncing into the future, as a testimony to say part of what the restoration that is promised in the kingdom, in the coming kingdom, when it's known in its fullness, part of what will happen is a restoration, a resurrection of relationship. Just as you see with this young man in relation to his mother. Jesus gives him back to his mother. Sarah, thank you for highlighting this. And as the mom, yes, what a moment to have that moment of reconciliation. What had previously been fractured, not in terms of like a relationship fracture, in terms of like the young man did something bad, but fracture in terms of life, right? Their connection had been fractured by the reality of death. And here you see Jesus stepping into that character of healing, which we've seen, to the point of, resurrection here. Now, I'll put a little asterisk on this, guys. When we use the term, this is kind of nerdy, but bear with me. In the Bible, we have examples where Jesus brings Lazarus back from the dead. We have an example here. We have an example with Paul, who brings a young boy who falls out of a window. That's a funny story, too. Back from the dead. In some ways, this could be a echo foreshadow of that as well, because that happens in the book of Acts. And we have seen previous examples, which is what I want to get to next, of how prophets, other people besides Jesus, who have come before Jesus in the Old Testament, where there's been moments of resurrection as well. Now, when we use the word resurrection, we have to be careful. We don't mean, to be honest, resurrection is not the best word choice. Hey, I know it's nuanced, but here's the delineation. Here's the difference. When we say resurrection, in a Christian sense, what is implied there is Jesus' resurrection, which includes a transformation. Jesus' resurrection is not the same as this one. And so more often than not, the cases that we see here is often referred to as resuscitation. Okay? Do you guys get the difference there? Coming back. This is like when, you've been dead and they zap you back. The difference is Jesus is zapping people back not after like a minute, but like, after 3 days or whatever. In the case 4 days, four days at least. In the case of Lazarus, I think it is, because he's like stinky dead. Lazarus is like super dead. But Lazarus does not undergo the same transformation that Jesus does in Jesus' resurrection. The reason this is very important is because this young boy will die again. You get that? Lazarus came back and then died again. If they would not have died, if they would have undergone the full transformation, that would have raised a whole bunch of really confusing questions about Jesus and Jesus' own resurrection. Make sense? So I'm using the term resurrection here simply because that's kind of like a vernacular term that we say when somebody comes back from the dead. But truly, it's more accurate here to say, Jesus brought this young man back to life, yes, but not the full resurrection promised transformation that we anticipate in the nearer distant future according to Jesus' timelines. He gets to decide that. But it's nuanced, and it's an important teaching that we don't often talk about in the church. We look past it because we consider it to be too complicated. Thank you, Katie. It is one of the best things that we get to do is spend time with people in these kind of spaces. It is easily one of the best and hardest things that I have the privilege of doing. So yeah, thank you. It is an amazing thing that God works through us as a church body to be there for people when they need it. It's truly one of the best, most spectacular, humbling, sacred experiences you can possibly have. Is being with somebody when they're dying or dead. You know, the process of dying. Yep, wouldn't trade it for anything. Doesn't mean it's easy. Doesn't mean it's fun. But it's sacred. Okay, so here, all right. Jesus gives him back to his mother. So shout out to all you moms out there. Yeah, Sarah, could you imagine what it'd be like to have, you know, that embrace? I love how you said, Sarah, I can't stop hugging him. You imagine growing up now as that young man? That poor young man, that mom must be like, you know, do you think she's a helicopter parent here on out? I lost you once, I'm not losing you again. I don't know. I'm just saying. All right. Great fear swept through the crowd. Fear's not always a bad thing. Fear's not always a bad thing, guys. And let's look up the word. Boom, 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 boom. Ooh, it's a little bit more intense. Intimidation. Awe-inspiring. These are other translations of that same Greek word. Intimidation, awe-inspiring. Yeah. So, you know, great awe swept through the crowd, the mega crowd. And the response is fascinating. They praise God. Interesting here. A couple things here. One, the response to resurrection, resuscitation is praise. The response is praise. Secondarily, notice who they're praising, God. This is a commentary from a Christological perspective on Jesus and the character of Jesus and the identity of Jesus, which is really what this whole story is all about. This is a statement having to do with Jesus in relation to godhood, divinity. He is not your average run-of-the-mill prophet. Yeah, I don't know. That's a really good question, Sarah. Was the young man a local hero, or was he quickly forgotten because everyone was focused on Jesus? That's a really good question. I don't know. I do think it's a good example of, certainly for the rest of his life, he was that guy. I mean, no question that for the rest of his life, this young man was that kid, that young man. You know, even when he's old and gray or whatever, he was still that guy whose life now becomes a living testimony to Jesus. So even if he got, you know, I would say he's a hero in so much as he points people to the reality of Jesus. Right? He becomes a living, tangible reminder of Jesus Christ, which in essence, each one of us should be doing, right? I mean, hopefully this is the case with each of our lives, that for each one of us, our lives become a living testimony. That's probably, yes, two truths and a lie would always be a gas for him. He'd always win, guaranteed. That's funny. All right, so here's kind of the summary statement. Here's where the story actually ends up, which is tied to what comes next. A mighty prophet has risen among us, and God has visited his people today. This whole story actually is oriented around this line. News about Jesus spread throughout Judea and the surrounding countryside. Yeah. Judea would have been farther south. So it's interesting that the news, because Jesus' stomping grounds are farther north, the news heads south. And that's interesting to note too. His popularity is making its way towards Jerusalem, which is to the south. Jesus' reputation and popularity continues to build towards Jerusalem, which is where he goes for the cross. So a mighty prophet has risen among us. And God has visited his people today. Uh-huh. So this is what the crux of this story is hinged on. The tension of who Jesus really is. Is he a prophet or something more? Is it possible that he is not only a prophet, but something even greater than a prophet, right? So, like, the irony of the words here is beautiful irony. The intricacy in word choice here. God has visited his people today. Well, in one way, you could say, yeah, God visited his people today and worked, through Jesus. In another way, you could say, no. God visited his people today. He's standing right over there. He's the dude that just raised the kid from the dead. That's God, right? And so you get this evolution of theology, what people say and think about God, related to Jesus, that for the crowds, they are now being pushed beyond their scope of what they had previously thought. He's more than a prophet. A mighty prophet has risen among us. He's more than your average prophet at the very least. And people are now asking questions about him being truly, this is a question of godhood and Messiah. This is a Messiah question. Is this the Messiah? What is the extent of what it means to be Messiah? God has visited his people today. Yeah, like literally, physically, tangibly. God showed up in some dusty sandals. God came walking through the village gate. It's not this idea that God was present in some ethereal way, but in a very tangible, real way. This statement is quite significant. The other reason why this is important, the mighty prophet has risen among us, is because it's cross-referencing this story with an Old Testament story from Kings. This is a story in Kings that has to do with Elijah. Elijah and the widow, starting in chapter 17? Yeah. Famous story, and it's one that really bothers a lot of Jewish people. Whoa, holy cow, didn't mean to do that. Hold on. 17. Going back to 17. Sorry, patience. Sorry, didn't mean to do that. All right. Here we go. So at this point in time in the story, who's Elijah? Elijah is one of the great prophets. He's a big deal. He's a big deal. Elijah. Often Elijah is considered to be the greatest of the prophets. All right, just bear with me on that. But generally speaking, that's not an unfounded claim that people make. He's a big deal. The Lord said to Elijah, "Go and live in the village of Zarephath, near the city of Sidon." How do you say Zarephath? Zarephath. I have instructed a widow there to feed you. All right. What you need to know here is that this is a non-Jewish town that is outside of the Jewish influence, outside of the Jewish community, outside of the Jewish faith, and there is a widow there. So this is a non-Jewish widow. This echoes, guys, the story before of the centurion, that faith can exist outside of the Jewish people. That's why a lot of this is a very intense pericope text. This is a big story in the Old Testament because here you have an example of faith happening outside of the traditional Jewish customs and the Jewish people. Elijah shows up here, and it's a widow, and she's got a son. Okay? Long story short, woman's son becomes sick and dies. Elijah prays over the son and brings the son back. I looked it up too. Let's see here. Here you go. Here's a great example. Blow it up a little. Here's a great. I was trying to find if we could find a clean parallel. Here's a clean parallel from one of the resources I have. In the First Kings texts with Elijah, it specifically says that Elijah comes to the gate of the town, and just like in Luke, we get that reference to the gate, right? The gate of the town. The gate of the town. It's the same echo. She's a widow. She was a widow. The widow's son dies. The widow's son dies. Elijah cries out to the Lord, and in this case, it says, he made compassion for her. The idea here of crying and crying out to the Lord is a sense, right? What's being captured there is a sense of compassion on this. Elijah stretches himself out over the child 3 times. This is one of the nuanced difference. When it says Elijah stretches himself out, a lot of people debate what this means, what this is. But it seems to say that he became prostrate over him, he laid hands on him, something like that. And he has to do it 3 times, whereas Jesus, just with a single word. Here you have Elijah reaching beyond himself to God. Jesus just walks up and does it himself. Right? And so you see the limit of Elijah in his dependency on God. You see here Jesus not needing to be dependent. He in and of himself has authority over life and death. And so you see a contrast between the two in that case. He's revived. The child is revived. Elijah gives him back to his mom just like Jesus. And in the same way, there's a moment at the end of the story where the woman says, wow, now I know you are a man of God. The word of God is in your mouth as truth. And then we get this statement, the crowd, a great prophet has risen among us. God has looked favorably upon his people, or God visited his people today. I like the visited. I think visited is a better translation than this. You go to the Greek, I like visited much more. So, the reason this is all important is basically this story of a small and inconspicuous village with a widow, whose son has died and comes back, gets at the fact that Jesus is more than Elijah. And Elijah, being arguably the greatest of the prophets, or at least one of the greatest of the prophets, this is placing Jesus on a trajectory of claiming his messiahship in a way that Luke hasn't done so strongly. This is Luke's big case where he keeps pushing us towards Jesus' identity. Okay? Which is exactly what is about to be challenged in the next texts. So, as soon as we get this affirmation of, and this suggestion by Luke that Jesus and his identity is centerpiece to what's going on in this story, that exact claim is what we're about to dive into next week. Because it's already 8:38 and we got to be done. That's why. All right. Well, there you go. We got through a whole whopping 6 verses, 11 through 17. Yeah. We got through a story. Well, I hope it was fun, guys. I had fun. Next week, we'll pick up where we left off. All right. Any final comments, questions from the Peanut Gallery? Anything for the Peanut Gallery before we boogie on out of here? While you guys are typing. Henry listened too. Hi, Henry. Does he get like a treat for hanging out and listening? He put up with me too, huh? Henry's a puppy, by the way. Some of you might not. It's not like a treat to a like a dog treat. That's what I was talking about. Not to be misunderstood. I just got a picture of you, Katie, like handing a treat to some child or something like that. Sorry. Yes, he stayed awake. I'm so glad. Well, hey guys, thank you for. Whoops, that's not a very good job there. Thanks for joining me tonight and hanging out as part of that whole online community, everybody. Appreciate it. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for hanging out. So glad to be with you tonight. Want to, as always, extend the invitation for you to come and join us Sunday mornings, wrapping up the Silly Things Christians Say this week. 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 10:30. Come join us on site online and bring somebody. You can hang out with me Thursday morning as well if you'd like. Love to have you join me on Thursday morning as we do Thursday morning meditation, 7:30 in the a.m. this coming Thursday morning. Thanks for tuning in. Thank you for being here. Hi, Linda. Thanks for tuning in. Thank you, Michelle. So glad. Yeah, good distinction between the resurrection and resuscitation. Good. I'm glad that was helpful. So thanks for bearing with me with my microphone tonight. I'll have to look into some troubleshooting on that. But hey, go live some lives. Go elevate Christ. Go be a church for those who aren't here yet. We will see you all and talk to you all soon. Thanks for tuning in tonight. God bless, guys.